Hi, and welcome to Chapter 25, our last learning objective 8. In this learning objective, we're going to talk a little bit about governments and government structure in terms of political stability, command versus capitalistic types of structures. And then we're going to take a look at a short video on forecasting past 2020 for economic growth in a global context. And then we'll take a look at two other short little videos that take a look at innovation and how to foster innovation and inclusion as part of economic growth. So let's go ahead and get to it. I'll share my screen with you. There we are. Okay, so again, we're going to take a look at how government structure and stability impact growth rates. So one of the things that we often know in economics is there is a trade-off between safety and rights. So we can give you all the rights that we want, but we do so at the safety. So as we increase the rights, the safety tends to go down, vice versa. You're seeing that right now with the Black Lives Movement. And so when we talk about property rights, in a capitalistic society, we have property rights. We have the right to enforce contracts through the Uniform Commercial Code, okay? And that allows us, again, the courts will enforce the property rights. If we don't have property rights, then we have a major problem. Again, we have fraud, corruption, for example, and this we might see in underdeveloped nations or sometimes in command economies that not all of the industries are under the same command type of economy. What that means is there might be government ownership of the factors of production of land, labor, and capital. Notice this is some of the byproducts that we see from corruption. So here's an example. I love this. This is a bridge in Rio de Janeiro. And, take a look at it. Kind of seems like it's useless, but this bridge is unnecessary as it doesn't shorten the road. The bridge cost 5 million US dollars. The opening event for the bridge was $80,000. People who live in this area of Rio de Janeiro earn about $700 per month. And so, you know, why did the bridge exist? We might ask ourselves a lot of those types of questions, particularly when we're talking about political issues and some of those kinds of things, even in our country. So political instability, again, revolutions and coups, we tend to see a lot of that. We want to know how stable is the government, because if you have warring factions that continue to change over the government entity, what can happen is private companies can be taken over by the government. And again, there's no incentive for us to invest in those types of nations because the threat of that occurring becomes really quite palatable and very difficult for us to maintain. There are two types of policies in terms of trade. There are inward oriented policies. And this is basically what we've been pursuing from an administration standpoint here in the US. Most economists do not agree with inward orientees. This is where you're going to see tariffs, you're going to see quotas, and you're going to see a lot of trade tit for tat. So kind of difficult to maintain economic growth. Again, this is what economists tend to say. It has an adverse effect, on economic growth. Outward-oriented policies would be things like NAFTA. That was a good example of an outward-oriented policy. Also, the European Union being part of that. And again, we've seen some countries as of late, for example, Great Britain leaving the European Union. So it does help integrate the world economy. We do know from an economic standpoint, it does lead to economic growth. Another factor that influences economic growth is the amount of population. Because all resources are scarce, the greater the population, then what we have are those resources have to be spread over more people. And that usually means that we're going to have a degradation of the types of resources. So a lot more consumers. Again, economists will say that stretches our natural resources. If we continue on our current ever-increasing population rate, then what we're going to have is some difficulty providing for that population. So many times you will see administrations and political issues centered around population growth. China's one-child policy is an example of that, although now it's 2 children. But again, why did they do that? It seems very foreign to us in this country, but limiting the number of children likewise means limiting the population. Some other examples, diluting capital stock. And again, when we talk about capital stock, machinery, those kinds of things, and then we get lower productivity per worker and a lower GDP per worker. So some of the ways to reduce the rate of growth, again, here we go. And equal opportunity, equal opportunities become pretty important to provide some alternatives to the traditional role of what women were in society. Again, promoting technological progress. If we have more people, then we have more scientists, more innovation. And so those are some of the positive externalities that should come from population growth. So here's a question, really. Why is so much of Africa poor? And if we look at the sub-Saharan Africa, and these are some statistics that your author had polled, poverty among smallholders in Africa would be 16 percentage points higher without the income from their natural resources. So here we can kind of take a look at some examples comparing sub-Saharan Africa to Latin America, South Asia, and East Asia. There is a lot of low capital investment. So for example, not a lot of people are, foreign direct investment is very low. And when we talk about foreign portfolio investment, again, kind of low. And these are some of the reasons why we're seeing this, particularly rampant corruption and the restriction of freedom. Okay, that's the end of my part for this. And then we're going to go on into, I think, 3 videos total. And I look forward to seeing you in chapter 26. Thanks.
The global economy is expected to grow by 3% annually over the next half-century. But growth will be much stronger and much faster in emerging economies than in the developed countries of the OECD. The United States is the world's biggest economy today, representing 23% of global economic activity. GDP will shrink to 18% by 2030 and just 17% in 2060. China, which produces about 17% of global GDP today, is expected to pass the US to become the world's biggest economy. It will produce 28% of global GDP in 2030 and should stay at that level through 2060. China's growth and that of other fast-developing emerging countries will be driven by a better educated and more productive workforce. India will also benefit from population growth. It will jump from 7% of global GDP today to 11% in 2030 and 18% in 2060. Population aging, on the other hand, will drag down growth in many countries and regions. The euro area is the world's second leading economy, with 17% of global GDP. As the number of active Europeans declines, Europe's share of the world economy will drop to 12% by 2030 and just 9% by 2060. Japan, which accounts for 7% of global GDP today, faces a similar crisis. Its aging population will push its share of global GDP down to 4% by 2030 and just 3% by 2060. Today, the 34-country OECD represents 65% of global GDP. This will drop to just 43% in 2060, smaller than China and India, and well below the combined GDP of emerging economies. Incomes and living standards in emerging economies will converge with those in the OECD. Today, per capita GDP in countries like China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey is just a fraction of that in the United States. After 50 years of rapid growth and shifting wealth, the emerging countries have drastically reduced the income gap with the United States. Richer OECD countries like France, Italy, Spain, Ireland, Greece will see their per capita income fall when compared with the US. None of these OECD projections are set in stone. Improving public finances and implementing bold structural reforms can boost long-term growth and living standards in advanced and emerging economies alike.
As a child, certain images are ingrained in your mind. For me, it was the annual trip to Mexico to visit my father's relatives. The harsh living conditions, the poverty. I can remember my family loading up our car with extra toys and clothing to give to random children along the way. Even then, I knew I wanted to help the people of Mexico. For your average worker in Mexico, you work 12-hour shifts and you're usually paid an average of $2 an hour. People are living in homes that are built from cardboard, far below a standard of life that we consider acceptable.
By winning Notre Dame's Social Venture Plan competition, Pablo Nava received resources to start his own company, Por Fin Nuestra Casa. Pablo will provide Juarez factory workers with a better standard of living through innovative, ultra-low-cost housing.
Every year there's 4 million containers that don't get used. What we want to do is recycle these containers and use them to build homes.
These containers are going to be able to provide people with a shelter where they get electricity and water. It's really more than just a container. It is turned into a home.
As long as goods are being transferred, it gives us the opportunity to use those containers to create safe communities for people to live in. Notre Dame's helped me learn that you can be a successful business person and still make a difference in the world.
The University of Notre Dame asks, what would you fight for?
Fighting for a healthy global economy. Fighting disease.
Fighting for justice.
Fighting to improve living standards. We are the Fighting Irish.
Clearly, the U.S. can and must do better to ensure the gains from the stronger economy are shared by all. Now, a more inclusive economy, a more inclusive labor market are also key to boosting growth and productivity. We now have mounting evidence that rising inequalities harm growth because up to the poorest 40% of the population find it too onerous to invest in their own skills and education. They're paying for their livelihoods, but they can't afford the luxury of investing in their own futures because they're spending all their income, paying for their present. So you have a deterioration of their outlook. Now, fighting inequality is not only a global and national concern, it's also very local. We've been reminded in recent months just how small and connected our troubled world has become. The refugee crisis, climate change, international terrorism, the heavy legacy of the economic crisis on growth and jobs, and rising inequality. And then what you call the systemic worldwide issues that connect with local issues. The best example, the tragedy in Orlando. But even as the effects of globalization spread, its impacts are always bound to play out locally. Our work on inequalities has shown that the gap between the rich and the poor is higher, often rising faster in larger cities, including in the wealthiest, primarily due to skills distribution and to the capturing of the top earners. In those cities, rich and poor people often live segregated in different neighborhoods.